I'm honored to welcome you all here this morning to John Jay College, my alma mater, to hear from our two speakers, President Jeremy Travis and Associate Professor Preeti Chauhan. They are the co-principal investigators of the Misdemeanor Justice Project here at the college. Richard always talks about the Great New York Experiment of reducing incarceration, stop and frisk, and arrest, all while achieving declines in crime. Today's forum looks at the incarceration piece of the Great New York Experiment. Jeremy and Preeti will present findings from their second New York City Department of Corrections data analysis, which is the 6th report from the Misdemeanor Justice Project, titled Trends in Custody, New York City Department of Correction, 2000 to 2015. This report focuses on pretrial detention, examining trends in custody status among individuals admitted to New York City jails. This topic is particularly timely given the significant investment New York City has been making in reforming its jail system, including Mayor de Blasio's recent announcement that they'll be providing reentry services to all individuals in the jail system, as well as programming during their stay. And just a few days ago, the Independent Commission on New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform, otherwise known as the Lippman Commission, released its, which Jeremy and Richard actually sat on, released its report calling for the closure of Rikers Island and the replacement with smaller, state-of-the-art facilities closer to the courts. Like their previous reports, I'm certain that the data presented today will be used to inform these discussions that are ongoing in New York City and nationally, particularly as it comes to how to best invest our resources to improve public safety. So please join me in giving me a warm welcome to Jeremy and Preeti.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Ashley, for once again joining with us and sponsoring this release of our 6th report of the Misdemeanor Justice Project. So I welcome all of you. We have a distinguished group here. I just want to acknowledge that we're joined this morning by former Police Commissioner Bill Bratton. Wonderful to have you here, Commissioner. The first Deputy Commissioner and John Jay alum, do I hasten to add, Ben Tucker, great to have you here, Commissioner. And particularly relevant for today's discussion, I'm not sure where he is, but former Commissioner Marty Horn from the Department of Corrections, who's on our faculty here. So, and he's been a good advisor on this particular project and many other things related to corrections. So on behalf of my colleague, Preeti Chauhan, I want to welcome all of you to the presentation of these findings from the Misdemeanor Justice Project. And before I go any further, I know it's important to acknowledge who has done so much of the work here, and I want to ask the team that's listed on this report to stand as I call their names. Quinn Hood, Irvin Balazan, Selena Cuevas, Olive Liu, Shannon Chomasak, and Adam Fira. What a team. Now, there are other members of the Misdemeanor Justice team here. They're working on other things that I'll talk about in a second, but we have really been able to pull together a very talented group of analysts and doctoral students and future leaders in our field. So the thanks to the Citizens Crime Commission are really central to our mission because it's because of our partnership with Richard and the Commission, our work with Ashley and others, that we've been able to create this forum where our findings have been released to just the right audience, people who are deeply involved in the criminal justice system, policymakers, practitioners, and we're very gratified that our work to date has been referenced so often in the press and in other outlets. As you know, we've published reports on misdemeanor arrest trends, on pedestrian stops, on summonses, and each one of those reports and the ones that we're doing today have found an audience at just the right time in the city, and it's not accidental that they were presented here at the Crime Commission. So I want to thank again Richard and Ashley for providing this forum for our work. So as Ashley mentioned, this is our second report on corrections. Our first was released in December. That report, which we will reference today multiple times because they are really tell a whole story, that report examined trends in admissions and looked at a snapshot of what was happening at the front door of the city's corrections department over the past 20 years. We documented in that report a steep decline, and we'll show you that slide in a second, in the admissions numbers at the front door by about half over that 20-year period. The report that we're releasing today is different. It adds to the first one. It looks at those admissions following the front door. What happens to these individuals, these cases, once they are admitted to custody, with a particular focus on those who are admitted in a pretrial status. We will look at three indicators to examine the custody experience. We will look at bail set, how much bail is being set for these cases, how long are they held in custody, known as length of stay, and, importantly, how are they released from custody. But it is critically important, this is what I want to say at the outset, that these two reports be reviewed together. Because of the significant and dramatic changes at the front door, the population coming in now is significantly different from the population coming in 20 years ago. So the variables of bail set, length of stay, and the method of release from custody have changed in part because of the changes in the incoming population. So the report that we are releasing today that you have in front of you is lengthy, 96 pages, has 99 figures. We're not going to show all the slides this morning. I know you're disappointed, but we are going to focus instead on a sub-story within a big story, and Preeti will present this in a moment. And the purpose of illustrating what we can see by a deeper examination is to demonstrate the power of the database. So through the Misdemeanor Justice Project, we've been able to create this phenomenal, unprecedented, rich database that shows the operations of the criminal justice system over, in the case of misdemeanor arrests, 30 years, and we want to demonstrate how useful this can be for a policy conversation. So the focus of the presentation today will be on pretrial custody and within two age groups, those 16 to 17, and who knows what's happening in Albany, but today may be the day when Raise the Age actually happens, a cause for celebration, and the Commission's been a big supporter of that. So it's important, and for that reason, to focus on that age group. But we're also focusing on the older individuals coming into corrections custody. This is a particularly interesting population, and you'll see why in a second. So look at this as an illustration of the flexibility and the capabilities of the database. We also recognize that today's release comes at a truly historic moment in our city, not just because of what's happening with Raise the Age in Albany, but because of the reports that Ashley mentioned. This past Sunday at John Jay, I'm honored to be able to say this at a press conference that we hosted, the Lippman Commission, formerly known as the Independent Commission on New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform, that had been convened by our speaker, Melissa Mark Viverito, and chaired by our former Chief Judge, Jonathan Lippman, released this report making basically three big recommendations. First, that the jail population be reduced from 9,700 to about 5,000 or so, a steep decline, and you'll see the challenge when we show you some of the trends that we've experienced. Second, that the city build a new network of borough-based jails. And third, that the city find new uses for Rikers, 400-acre plot of land that's out there in the East River, and all sorts of things could happen. An unusual opportunity for the city. And then last week, at the end of the week, Mayor de Blasio, who earlier had announced that the city's detention population had come down by 18% during his term, a big change, announced that he was embracing these recommendations as well. So now we have the governor, the mayor, the speaker, the former chief judge, the commission. We had three of the 5 DAs here, many members of the city council for the press conference. We have this remarkable political alignment around the idea of decommissioning Rikers Island, but the predicate to that is a reduction in the jail population. So in this new environment, this new era, this is the central challenge facing the city, is to how to think about reducing the population further. So we hope, of course, that our report will add to that discourse, and as we always do, those of you who have been with us for the earlier reports, we just present the facts, and we let people interpret them and find their own causal relationships as they choose. So one more thank you. We want to thank the Department of Corrections for their really wonderful partnership in this analytical project. Eric Sorensen and Diane Firstman, who are the data mavens within the Department of Correction, have been great colleagues. Commissioner Pont and his executive staff have been remarkable allies, again, in sort of helping us understand what we're presenting today. They're represented today by Anna Marzullo, who's here. Thank you for coming, Anna. She's been our point of contact and a wonderful colleague. So there's a generosity that we saw first with Commissioner Bratton, frankly, when we went to him and asked for data on misdemeanor arrests, that we then saw with Judge Lippman when we asked for the summons data, we then saw with Commissioner Pont when we asked for the corrections data. That's a classic sort of New York generosity that we appreciate. But we can't go any further without thanking the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. We would not be here without their support. We thank the Arnolds, Laura and John, and we thank Matt Alsdorf, the foundation vice president. And we have a particular thanks and what can I say? It's like we're siblings to Virginia Bursch, who's here, Deputy Director of National Implementation for Criminal Justice at the Arnold Foundation. She's been just, you can't ask for better, Virginia. We're really delighted to continue working with you. So they provided guidance and support and money. And what I think you also know is that with their support, we've now expanded this work to add 6 more cities around the country. So we have a 7-city network. LA is one of them, Bill. They're going to be looking at exactly these types of data around the city for the first time nationally. So it's with deep gratitude to the foundation. Okay, let's get to work with the presentation. So if this works as I hope it does, there we go. There are all the thank yous. Okay, we always start these with just setting the stage. Most of this is known to this audience, but let's just do it one more time. So we, of course, start by just pointing out the remarkable decline in crime in New York. Between 1980 and 2015, violent crime is down 70%. Nonviolent crime is down by 85%. This is the predicate for understanding anything else that's going on in the city, is that the city is safer than it's ever been, safer than any other large city in America. Tip of the hat to the police department for this work. And this is the beginning of thinking about the rest of the criminal justice system. So the next slide shows some trends of enforcement activity that we presented in our third report. So just look at the green line, which is felony arrests. There was a slight rise, and they declined slightly. You could call that almost stable. It's not quite. Misdemeanor arrests, however, in a very different fashion, rose almost a 4-fold increase from 1980 to 2010. Some ups and downs along the way. A significant increase in arrest activity, the subject of our first report, and then has started falling in 2010, falling significantly, but still much higher than before. Pedestrian stops, which was the source of a lot of discussion and controversy within New York, started, this is the first time they had good data, 2002, at about 145,000, and then by 2011, look at that sharp increase to 647,000 stops. And then, I don't know what to say, I dropped like a stone. I don't know quite what to call that. That's one of the more remarkable trends that we've ever seen in criminal justice. 2015, the last year for which we have data, there's more recent data, it dropped to about 21,000 stops in 2015. You take all of these declines and add the summons decline, which is the red line. So the decline in what we call enforcement activity is a decline of about 900,000 fewer enforcement actions taken by the NYPD in 2015 compared to 2010. This is what Commissioner Bratton has termed the peace dividend. This is a remarkable change in our city, and we should note that before we start talking about corrections. So let's shift focus a bit to corrections. This slide, we thank the Lippman Commission. They used some data from Vera and DOC and others. This slide is tells a fascinating story. My guess is not well known to New Yorkers, even those in the know here. This is a trend line that shows the city's jail population from 70 to 2016. Note the sharp decline in the 70s to a low point of about 7,000 or so, and then a very steep increase up to a high of about 20,000+. Those of us just my personal story here is this is when I was in police department and City Hall. This was an intense time. Marty remembers it well. This was the crack epidemic. This was a response to that situation in our city. Sharp increase in the jail population. That's not admissions, that's the overall population. And then since that peak, the population has declined, well, not quite every year, but almost every year, and now is down at a number of about 9,700 or so, the lowest in a long period of time. So in our report that we released in December, we focused on this period of time, just to show you where we're looking at, from 95 to 2015, so that 20-year period is our area of our sort of focus, our framework. And what we found is a decline in admissions. So when we say there's been a 50% decline in admissions, it's about 45 actually, this is what we're talking about. This is the front door. This is not stock population as the other chart was. This is at the front door, sharp decline in admissions over this 20-year period. We have from the Department of Corrections another way of saying, in essence, the same thing, although they're not the same because analytically they're different, but the trends are about the same. This is average daily population in corrections custody. We say Rikers sometimes, that's not accurate. There's lots of corrections custody. And we see a decline from about 18,000 in daily custody to a little under 10,000, which is where we are now. So now we're going to dig one level deeper into the admissions. On the left, we're going to look at that in terms of legal status. By legal status, we mean were they held pretrial, were they admitted as sentenced, whether they're in parole warrants, or for some other reason. So that's what we call legal status. It has nothing to do with the case. It's sort of where are they in the legal process. It doesn't have to do with the charge, rather. It has to do with the legal status. So importantly, because this is going to be the focus of Preeti's presentation, we see a decline in the number of people coming into corrections as pretrial detainees, right? That's the blue line. We also see, just note the red line, which is the number of people coming into corrections as sentenced inmates. Just because of the scale here, it's hard to understand how big a change that is. That almost doubles from, looks like 12,000 to 20+ thousand. From 1995 to 2007, and then falls pretty sharply to 2015. That's about a 50% drop or so. So the sentence population is important, particularly if we want to reduce the overall population. It's not going to be our focus today, and there's been some up and downward trend. But the big story here is the decline in the pretrial population, which is not surprising given what we know about the admissions rate. So now we want to look at these two trends as a matter of percentages. So at the front door, if you're checking people coming in the front door, you're the corrections department, and you look at 10 people, what percent of them are pretrial, what percent of them are sentenced or other? The other, by the way, the green and yellow lines are parole violations and others, right? So this next one shows that the percent of the admissions cohort that are pretrial detainees has vacillated between 80 and 70% or so. Now it's going back up again. The percent of the incoming cohort that are city sentenced to city time, less than a year, served that time on Rikers Island, has also vacillated significantly from 10% to 20% and back down to, it looks like about 13% or so. So when we show this to the executive staff at corrections, they were interested in noting that the number coming in as pretrial detainees has gone up again, right? So that's, from their point of view, that's their line of work, as it were. So I'm now going to turn it over to Preeti. I can never say enough about how impressive Preeti is about the work that she's done here on the Misdemeanor Justice Project. So Preeti is a member of our faculty. She's a psychologist. Her area of scholarly interest is community level functioning with a particular focus on racial disparities, which is a perfect background for the work that we do. We first hatched this idea with Bettina's help 4.5 years ago, 4 years ago. And it has taken off, and it is where it is today with this national footprint and very high impact locally, and a whole scholarly set of activities where we have people around the country in various universities writing papers, and we're in journals. We have a conference coming up. I mean, this is a major engine of new ideas and reform in our world, and it's a tribute to Preeti Chauhan. So please join me in welcoming Preeti Chauhan.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. And again, I just want to say thank you to the Citizens Crime Commission in co-releasing this report with us, and especially to Richard and Ashley. To Anna Marzullo, who's here from Correction. She's been a great partner in sort of getting support for our work. And although Diane and Eric are not here, I don't see them, they have been instrumental in us understanding these data, which are very complicated. So I just want to thank them as well. And finally, to the Arnold Foundation, and especially to Virginia. She's just been such a sense of support, not just for the project, but also for me personally. So thank you, Virginia. So a couple of things I want to point out. The slides that I'm going to go through are slightly different than the slides that you have in front of you. We made some last-minute changes, but all the figures are exactly the same. And again, just to put this report that you have in front of you in context, our first report, which President Travis sort of highlighted back here, focused on admissions to corrections. And we looked at admissions by demographics and by charge levels, so felonies, misdemeanors, and then more nuanced charges, and saw how those trends changed over time. This report focuses almost exclusively on pretrial admissions because that is the line, as you see, the blue line, that's experienced the most significant change, and it is of the highest volume in corrections. And frankly, we just didn't have enough room in the report to do everything. So we focused on the pretrial admissions. And as President Travis mentioned, that is linked to the three indicators that we're going to look at today, which is bail amount set by the courts, length of stay, how long individuals are staying, and how they're being discharged from the courts. The full report that you have in front of you examines these three indicators in several nuanced ways. So by charge level, misdemeanors, felonies, it examines these trends by more nuanced charge categories, such as felony drug charges, by various demographics, race, age, and gender, and by borough. We are only going to focus on a small sub-story because this is a pretty complicated story to tell, as you'll see. There are five main, I think, take-home findings that we have from this report that I'll continue to highlight throughout all the numbers I'm going to be blasting at you. One is that pretrial admissions have declined. They've declined for felonies and they've declined for misdemeanors, and they've declined substantially. But the sharpest decline has been for admissions for felony drug charges, and this includes both felony drug possession and felony drug sale. Bail amounts have increased for all age groups. Pretrial length of stay has increased for all age groups, as you'll see, but the number of people impacted on extreme ends really vary between age groups. And again, you'll see what I mean when I show you the slides. And then discharge categories really vary by age group, and as you'll see in the report in front of you, discharge categories also vary by charge, more nuanced charges, charge level, and borough. I won't be going into that. In terms of what I will be doing for the next 10, 15 minutes is laying the foundation, going back to the big picture, but focusing this time just on pretrial admissions and looking at more nuanced charge categories. And then we'll look at the sub-story of age groups, looking at pretrial admissions by age groups, bail amount, length of stay, and then discharge. In the next several slides, you'll see two main findings that will stick out. One is that felony and misdemeanor admissions have declined, and the steepest and sharpest decline has been for felony drug charges by 75% from 1995 to 2015. So a dramatic decline in admissions for that charge category. And again, that includes both sale and possession. So we'll see changes over time, and when we get to the last year that we have the data, the snapshot of 2015, what you'll see is that the largest proportion of pretrial admissions over time ends up being, in 2015, violent crimes, followed by felony drug charges, and then followed by person-related misdemeanor charges, and the biggest charge code in that is assaults. So here are the numbers. The red line is felony, the blue line is misdemeanors, and we see that the felony decline is much more pronounced than the misdemeanor admission line. And when we look at this as a proportion, what we see is that felonies over this, felony charges over this time span accounted for between 50 to about 63 pretrial admissions, and misdemeanors accounted from 28 to 40% of pretrial admissions. So proportionally not as dramatic of a change as in the pure volume and the raw numbers. Next, we wanted to sort of break down the felony charges a little bit more to see if we can disentangle some more meaningful differences in what happened with felonies. Here, what we did was we mapped all of our charge codes onto the Uniform Crime Report codes, which are used by the FBI, and then we aggregated up into 8 meaningful categories, or what we thought were meaningful. So violent crimes, that's murder, rape, robbery, and assault. Drug charges, burglary, weapons, larceny, other person-related, other property-related, and then other. So the 2 lines that really stand out here are the orange line, which is the felony drug charges. Again, this massive decline by 75%. And then the red line is violent crimes. And what we see is admissions for violent crimes surpassed drug charges in 2010. Up until then, admissions for drug charges were much higher in volume compared to any of the other charges. And what we see is that all of those other charges on the bottom are sort of lumped together and stay relatively stable compared to these 2 more dramatic charge categories that we see on top. And proportionally, we see a similar phenomenon. So in 1995, 33% of all pretrial admissions, this includes misdemeanors in the denominator, were for felony drug charges, and this declined to 15% by 2015. And for violent crimes, what we see is it's approximately 20% in 1995, goes down a bit, and then increases to end at 20% in 2005. And again, we see that violent crimes surpasses proportionally pretrial admissions, surpasses felony drug charges in terms of pretrial admissions, The other thing to note, again, we see both on the left and the right, is that the remaining charge categories are relatively low and stable and don't really change that much. Next, we wanted to look at misdemeanor charge categories, more nuanced misdemeanor charges. And we broke these categories down into 5 meaningful categories. Person-related misdemeanors, so assault being the predominant penal law code there, drug charges, larceny, property and theft, and other. The first thing to note here is that we don't see anything as dramatic as the felony drug charges in the misdemeanors. They're all relatively low, relatively stable compared to the felony drug charges and the violent crimes. The red line is person-related misdemeanors, and what we see is that it sort of vacillates, but by 2010, it's the highest charge category among misdemeanors. The blue line is misdemeanor drug charges, which peaks in 2007 and then declines pretty sharply. And then the purple is sort of this catch-all other that we couldn't really categorize into anything else, but is relatively high in terms of volume. And then the remaining 2 are larceny is the green, and orange is property and theft. Proportionally, what we see is that misdemeanor person-related charges by 2015 is the highest charge category among misdemeanors, but not really among all pretrial admissions, which I'll show you in a minute. So to compare these side by side, what we see on the left is that violent crimes are the highest proportion coming in as a charge category in 2015, followed by felony drug charges, followed by person-related misdemeanors, which is on the right in the red. And this is very different from 1995, where felony drug charges were by far the largest proportion of charges coming through the front door. So this is really important to keep in the background as we're thinking about bail and length of stay and how individuals are released, because this profile will impact all of those indicators. So to switch to sort of our sub-story here, we're going to do an illustration by age group. And here we switch from 1995 to 2000 to 2015. So we truncate our timeline by 5 years, and I'll clarify why in a little bit. But you'll note that the timeline is shorter. We looked at pretrial admissions aggregately. Now I want to show you the pretrial admissions by age group. And you'll see two key findings. One is that the number of pretrial admissions declined for all age groups, but as a proportion, pretrial admissions for violent crimes have increased, pretrial admissions for felony drug charges have decreased. We saw this at the aggregate level. What's interesting here is when you break this down by age group, those increases and decreases are especially pronounced for the younger age groups compared to the older age groups. So this is number of pretrial admissions by age groups. We have 5 age categories. 16 to 17 is red, 18 to 20 blue, 21 to 24 green, 25 to 34 orange, 35 and older purple. Declines in all age groups by at least 40%, some age groups experiencing more steep declines than others, but we just see a general pattern of all age groups experiencing a decline. Now I'm going to show you the 2 charge categories that were the most dominant in 2015, the violent crimes and the felony drug charges by age group. Here, what we see is in 2000, 16 to 17-year-olds, if they were admitted pretrial, 36% of them were being admitted for a violent crime. This increased to 54% by 2015. So the denominator here in every case is the number of pretrial admissions for that age group. What we can also see is that the older age groups also experienced increases in the proportion of violent crimes, but they're not nearly as steep and pronounced as they are for the younger age groups. So the older age groups just generally get less steep in terms of their increase in the proportion of pretrial admissions for violent crimes. Let's contrast that to the felony drug charges. So a couple of things to point out here. The 16 to 17-year-olds, which is the red line, in 2000 are distinctively different from the other age groups and much lower at 20%, and they have a rapid decline and end at about 3% in terms of felony drug charges and pretrial admissions for felony drug charges. What we also see is that the other age groups were all clustered together between 25 and 29, and over time they start diverging. And the younger age groups experience a steeper fall compared to the older age groups. So by the time we get to 2015, we sort of see a staggered effect in that the 35 and older are the most likely, most likely to be admitted for felony drug charges, followed by the younger age groups in sort of succession. So again, this is something to keep in mind as we're talking about bail, as we're talking about length of stay, and discharge category. Okay, so we wanted to capture the true bail amount, which in our data meant excluding a couple of data points. One was placeholders and flags or dollar bail. We excluded those. We excluded any bail over $1 million because that seemed like a big outlier. And our unit of analysis was admission year, rather than, I'm going to flip to discharge year a little bit later, but here it's the year that the individual was admitted. And I'm going to say individual just because it's easy to say, but I want to note that the unit of analysis is actually admissions, and a person can be in 1 year multiple data times. Bail amount set. Bail amount set increased for all age groups. It increased for 16 and 17-year-olds. It increased for those 35 and older. But the number of individuals, or actually pretrial admissions with the highest bail amounts, decreased for the younger age group, but increased for the older age group. I know that's a little bit of a mental gymnastic, and you'll see what I mean when I show you the numbers, but just kind of look for that when I'm showing you the data. Now, there's various ways we can present bail. We can do means, we can do medians, we can do distributions, and we really struggled with what to do, so we did it all. So you'll sort of see it all here. So let's start with the mean. The mean includes outliers, so the mean will include bail of $900,000 if that's set for anyone. And a couple of things to point out here, the 35 and older, which is the purple line, is consistently, almost consistently lower, and that age group is set apart from the younger age groups, which all sort of vacillate up and down, but everybody does experience an increase or has an increase in bail amount set. We looked at median, which essentially indicates that half of the people are above the dotted line and half of the people are below the dotted line within that age group. And I'll just point out a couple of trends. The red line is 16 to 17, the blue line is 18 to 20, and the median for both of those age groups more than doubled in terms of bail amount set. The purple dotted line kind of gets lost, and you see there is a real increase there, but it's not nearly as dramatic as that for the 16 to 17-year-olds and 18 to 20-year-olds. So in some ways, the medians and the means sort of parallel one another. Just want to point that out because that doesn't become the case when we look at length of stay a little bit later on. And then we wanted to look at distribution of how these bail amounts vary. So I want to just point out one thing. The report you have with you that you're taking with you doesn't actually have distributions. We have the full distributions up on our website, which we can give to you. And in about 15 days, we'll have a 186-page report, which will have the distributions in there for every single set of analyses. So we had 5 bail categories, 500 or less, 501 to 1,000, 1,001 to 2,500, 2,501 to 7,500, and then more than 7,500. The deeper the blue, the higher the bail. A couple of other things I want to point out. We only show snapshots of 4 years, 2000, 2005, 2010, and 2015, because it was harder to see a trend with all 15 years. So some of these fluctuations can vacillate in those in-between years, but we see a pretty consistent trend here. Last thing to point out is that there's a sample size on top, and what we see is the volume is consistently decreasing, and we saw that with the pretrial admissions. So from 3,700 16 to 17-year-olds with a valid bail amount in 2000 to 1,200 in 2015, a substantial decline in the number of 16 to 17-year-olds who have a valid bail amount. Now, this is what I meant by bail amounts are increasing, but the number of pretrial admissions in the higher end for this younger age group is decreasing. So what we see on the left is, in 2000, 625 16 to 17-year-olds had a bail amount of more than 7,500. And that number reduced to 436. So while the proportion is higher, the number is actually lower. On the other extreme, and I'm just focusing on the extremes here, we see the same thing. 629 16 to 17-year-olds had a bail amount of 500 or less in 2000, and this went down to about 100. Now let's contrast that to the 35 and older. Same bail categories. Again, we see this reduction in volume by about 8,000. And we see that the blue is getting deeper and bail amounts are increasing. But here, in terms of the numbers, we see something different. In 2000, 2,800 individuals 35 and older had a bail amount of more than 7,500. And this increased by almost 2,000 to 4,700. And looking at the other extreme, about 6,100 individuals 35 and older had a bail amount of 500 or less, and this decreased to 1,700. So just to sort of recapture this, those 35 and older are more likely to come in for felony drug charges, less likely to come in for violent crimes. The opposite is true for the 16 to 17-year-olds. Both groups had an increase in bail amount set, but the numbers impacted within the extremes vary by age group. So now flipping to a related indicator, which is length of stay. And we wanted to capture true pretrial length of stay. So for those admitted pretrial and then discharged pretrial, it was just the amount of time between admission and discharge date. For those admitted pretrial but discharged as, say, something else like city sentenced, what we actually did was calculate the time between admission date to sentence date. Ideally, we would have had conviction date, but we didn't have that in our data, so we used sentence date as a proxy. So for instance, if someone was admitted pretrial and discharged as city sentence, we're only capturing that pretrial part of it and not the city sentence part of it. And here we switch our unit of analysis to discharge year rather than admission year. And this is the reason we truncated our timeline from 1995 to 2000, because it allowed us to capture people that may have been, say, in for 5 years. And this allowed us to capture all the outliers. Two key findings. You'll see pretrial length of stay increased on average for all age groups. The medians aren't as dramatic. And again, you'll see that the longer stays, the number of individuals in the younger age groups are a smaller number. And for the longer stays in the older age group, the number of individuals are larger. This is the pretrial length of stay. What we see, again, and we saw this with bail amount, is that the younger age groups, so not the purple line, all relatively start the same, and then the younger age groups start experiencing more dramatic increases. The 35 and older, which is purple, pretty consistently below the younger age groups up until about 2013. Let's now look at the median, so half the people above, half the people below, and we don't see nearly the same parallel increases that we saw with bail amount. In the median, it's more stable. Everybody is staying less than 9 days as a median. So half the people are staying less than 9 days, and then half are staying more than 9 days, regardless of age category. In 2000, all the ages were relatively similar, and then there was somewhat of a divergence, but not nearly as dramatic as we saw with the bail amount. To flip and look at the distribution, here's the distribution for pretrial length of stay for 16 to 17-year-olds. We see a little bit of a deeper blue, but again, not as much as we saw with the bail amount. Let me explain the charge categories here. So we have 0 days. So this is a person that's basically in and out, and they don't stay overnight. We have 1 to 7 days, 8 to 30 days, 31 to 90, 91 to 180, 181 to 365, and then more than a year. You'll note the reduction in volume again from 4,600 to about 1,600. And on average, we see that 50% or more are staying less than a week, regardless of the year we're looking at, which parallels then this median line. And in looking at the extreme ends, what we see is that in 2000, 93 16 to 17-year-olds stayed more than a year, and that decreased slightly to 89 in 2015. And on the opposite end, the 0 days, 283 16 to 17-year-olds just came in and out, and that decreased to about 100 in 2015. And to then contrast that to our older age group, a couple of things to note again: the volume down by 15,000 from 35,000 to 20,000. Again, about 50% or more, depending on year, stayed less than a week. And on this end, what we have is that 511 individuals in 2000 in this age category stayed for more than a year, and this increased to 619 by 2015. And on the other extreme, the coming in and out, we see a decrease. So 5,300 individuals in this category stayed for 0 days, and that decreased to 1,300 in 2015. Now I'm going to sort of wrap up and show you how these individuals were discharged in these two age categories. So we saw charges that they're coming in for, bail amount set, how long they're staying, and finally, how are they leaving. And we had 5 charge categories. We had bail paid, ROR, which is basically just released on your own recognizance, ACD, acquittal, conditional discharge, dismissal. We combined sentence expired, time served, and then we had prison transfer. And again, the unit of analysis here, again, is discharge year rather than admission year. what we'll see is that there's variability in how our two age groups that we've been looking at are released from corrections if they're admitted pretrial. For the 16 to 17-year-olds, bail paid and ROR consistently the most common discharge categories. And then for the individuals 35 and older, bail paid and sentence expired consistently the most common discharge. Well, less consistent actually, you'll see in just a second. So here is the 16 to 17-year-olds. And we see bail paid, which is the red line, ROR, which is the blue line, accounts for more than 60% of the discharge categories for this youngest age group. Sentence expired, time served is that orange line, prison transfer purple, and then the green line is the ACD, acquittals, and dismissals. And those are substantially lower, and the bail paid and ROR really stand out as the predominant charges. We see something different for the 35 and older. The first thing I want to point out is that the orange line up until 2014 was the most common discharge category, and that's sentence expired, time served. So over 15 years, that was the predominant form of discharge for this older age group. The red is bail paid, ROR is the green, and we see those sort of vacillate up and down, with bail paid in 2015 being the most common discharge category for this age group, followed by sentence expired, time served. And again, if we go to this age group, the youngest age group, sentence expired, time served really doesn't show up as a predominant charge category. So there are differences in how these two age groups are leaving corrections. So just to wrap up, what I think I've shown you, what I hope I've shown you, is that pretrial admissions for felonies and misdemeanors have declined. More pronounced declines for felonies, and the most pronounced decline for felony drug charges by 75%. Bail amounts have increased and pretrial length of stay has increased, but in terms of the total touch points or the actual number of pretrial admissions, that varies on extreme ends depending on which age group you're looking at. And discharge categories for pretrial admissions also varied by age group.